everybody. Our passage this morning is derived from John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. It says, Jesus heals a man born blind. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been born blind. His disciples asked him, "Teacher, whose sin caused him to be born blind? Was it his own or his parents' sin?" Jesus answered, "His blindness has nothing to do with his sins or his parents' sins. He is blind so that God's power might be seen at work in him. As long as it is day, we must keep on doing the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light for the world." After he said this, Jesus spat on the ground and made some mud with a spittle. He rubbed the mud on the man's eyes and said, "Go and wash your face in the pool of Siloam." This name means sent. So the man went, washed his face, and came back seeing. His neighbors then, and the people who had seen him begging before this, asked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "He is the one," but others said, "No, he isn't, he just looks like him." So the man himself said, "I am the man." How is it that you can now see?" they asked him. He answered, "The man called Jesus made some mud and rubbed it on my eyes and told me to go to Siloam and wash my face. So I went and I washed, and as soon as I washed, I could see." "Where is he?" they asked. "I don't know," he answered.
Thank you, Mark, for reading for us this morning. It's good to be here. It's good to see all of you present and to welcome you if you're visiting with us this morning. Last week we looked at the story of Jesus healing the lame man at the pool in Jerusalem, which is recorded in John chapter 5. And we saw from that story how the man's response to Jesus was ambiguous and inadequate. Although he had been healed by Jesus, he failed to make any kind of confession of faith in Jesus. Instead, his actions led to Jesus being persecuted by the religious leaders of the Jews. Well, this morning we're going to look at another story, this time from John chapter 9, which has some similarities to last week's story, but also some important differences as well, particularly in the response that the man in today's story makes to Jesus. Both stories involve a man who has an infirmity. In John chapter 5, it's a man who has been lame for 38 years. Here in John chapter 9, it's a man who has been blind since his birth. Both stories involve a pool of water. The lame man is lying at the pool of Bethesda, waiting to be healed. The blind man is told by Jesus to wash in the pool of Siloam so that he may see. In both stories, Jesus disappears from the scene after the healings have taken place. Both healings take place on a Sabbath day and involve a dispute with the Jewish religious authorities over the observance of the Sabbath. In both stories, Jesus seeks out the men who have been healed in order to help them with their spiritual healing. And this is really where the similarities in the two stories end, and we see the difference in the responses that each man makes to Jesus. The man in chapter 5 is non-committal. He doesn't make a commitment to become a disciple of Jesus. But as we shall see, the man in chapter 9 is willing to commit himself to Jesus and to become a follower of Jesus. Let's look at the story then here in John chapter 9. But chapter 8 ends with Jesus being in the temple, and he leaves the temple. And as he comes out of the temple in chapter 9, Jesus sees this man who has been blind from his birth. This man has never been able to see. He's never been able to appreciate the variety of colours in nature. He's never admired the beauty of a sunset or a sunrise. He's never looked upon the faces of his parents or those he loves. And his blindness has prevented him from working and earning his own living. In verse 8 we learn that he's a beggar, relying upon the kindness and the generosity of others. Perhaps he was a well-known figure around the temple area, begging from those who were going into the temple for worship, just as today we sometimes see familiar with sights of homeless people who are outside a station or outside a shop who are asking for help. Perhaps he was a figure like that, someone who was well known to the local community. But Jesus and his disciples see this man, and they know him to be the blind beggar. They know that he's been blind from his birth. And the presence of the blind man gave Jesus' disciples the opportunity to pose a question which troubled them. In chapter 9, verse 2, they asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The relationship between sin and suffering was one that concerned the Jews and one which concerns us as well. Is suffering a consequence of sin? Is suffering a punishment for sin? The Jews held the view that suffering and sin were connected, and this is reflected in the question asked by the disciples. This man has been blind from birth, so the way they're thinking is, well, someone must have sinned then. So was it him or was it his parents? There was a belief amongst some of the Jews that a baby in the womb could sin. The alternative suggested by the disciples is that the man is suffering because of the sin of his parents. He suffers because they sin. Well, in answering his disciples, Jesus dismisses this idea that the man's condition is attributed to anyone's sin. He says it was not that this man sinned or his parents. There is no connection here between the man being blind and any sin that he or his parents might have committed. Instead, Jesus indicates the purpose of the man's blindness by saying he is blind so that the works of God might be manifest in him. The man's blindness will provide the opportunity for the works of God to be displayed. And Jesus goes on to say, we must work the works of him who sent me whilst it is day. Night comes when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus must do the work of God whilst he has the time and the opportunity. And he says this is why he was sent. And that opportunity is not going to last forever. When Jesus is taken away from them, the opportunity for him to work will come to an end. So through this man's blindness, Jesus must do the work which God has sent him to do and to reveal the greatness and the power of God's work. And so in this way, Jesus will demonstrate himself to be the light of the world. The healing itself is recorded very briefly here in verses 6 and 7. Not a lot of detail is given. As Jesus was talking with his disciples, we're told that he spat on the ground and he made some clay with the spittle. He then applied the clay to the man's eyes and he instructed him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash. John tells us the word Siloam means sent. Jesus was sending him to the pool. Well, Jesus could have healed the man immediately, of course, but he didn't. Instead, he involved the man himself in the process, perhaps as a way of testing his willingness to obey. Is this man willing to take Jesus at his word and go to the pool and wash his eyes? And Jesus then disappears from the scene. And he doesn't come into the story again until verse 35 of the chapter. Meanwhile, in obedience to what he's been told to do, the man has gone to the pool to wash. And when he returns, he can see. Verse 7 says, so he went and washed and came back seeing. What a wonderful moment that must have been for that man. That nothing is said here about how he reacted to the healing, but we can only imagine the joy that he must have experienced, as for the first time in his life, he can now see. See all of these wonderful things around him. What a wonderful moment it must have been for him. It's hard then perhaps to understand how such a joyful moment as this could very soon become such a source of controversy and hostile contention. When the man returned from the pool of Siloam, his neighbours and others who knew him as this blind beggar who hung around the temple, were confused and they wondered about his identity. There was now something strange about this man. And some asked, is not this the man who used to sit and beg? Didn't we used to see him sitting out there begging? And some says, yes, it is him. Others disagreed. No, he is like him. Well, he just looks like that man. And so the man himself had to confirm his identity. He said, I am the man. I am the one you're thinking. I'm the one who used to sit there and beg. And so the neighbours then questioned him, then how were your eyes open? If this is the blind beggar they all knew, well, how is it that he's now able to see? And so the man tells his story. The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. It's as simple as that. This man, Jesus, told me, made some clay, put it on my eyes, told me, go and wash. I did it, and now I can see. The man knows the name of the one who healed him. He knows his name is Jesus. But that's about all that he knows. And when they ask him, where is he? Where is this man? The blind man replies, I don't know. Jesus has gone. He's disappeared from the scene. So the neighbours decide, well, this remarkable incident needs some further investigation. And so they take this formerly blind man to the Pharisees. And there then follows a detailed investigation into the facts and a hostile interrogation of the man who had been blind. And from verse 14, we learn that this healing had taken place on the Sabbath, same as last week's story. Now, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And this is, of course, significant for the rest of the story. For it is Jesus' perceived disregard for the Sabbath that was the real offence here. That is what really upset these Pharisees. So the Pharisees begin by asking the man how he received his sight. And with brevity, the man repeats what he has said to the neighbours. He put clay on my eyes, and I wash, and I see. He says it even briefer. You can tell I'm fed up telling people this story. I don't keep wanting to go over it. This is what happened. And the man's testimony led to a disagreement amongst the Pharisees. Some said of Jesus, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. In their view, Jesus has violated the Sabbath. And he's done that first because Jesus had made clay with his spittle and mixed it up, and that action was regarded as kneading, as you would knead dough to make bread, and kneading was work which was not allowed on the Sabbath. So he'd broken the law there. And second, healing was forbidden on the Sabbath. Medical care could only be given on the Sabbath if life was in danger. And the blind man's life was not in danger. He'd been blind since birth. There were no threats to his life with this. And therefore they said that what Jesus had done in healing the man on the Sabbath broke the Sabbath. These Pharisees would condemn anyone who did not share their view. And because Jesus had broken their interpretation of the Sabbath, therefore they concluded, well, he cannot be from God. He doesn't do things the way that we think they should be done, and therefore he cannot be from God. But there were some others there who were asking, well, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? So they looked at the sign. They're looking at things a little differently to that first group. They looked at the sign, at the miracle that Jesus had performed in giving sight to this blind man. And their reasoning, they concluded, well, if Jesus was a sinner, if he really was a sinner, if he'd broken the Sabbath, then he would not be able to do this. How can he do it if he's a sinner? So for them, the sign confirmed that Jesus must be a good man, acting with God's approval. So the interrogators themselves were divided over the issue. And so now they asked the blind man what he thought about Jesus. What do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? He was the one who opened your eyes. So what's your opinion of him? And the man replies, he is a prophet. The man's understanding of Jesus has made some progress here. Earlier he had spoken to his neighbours of the man called Jesus, and now he speaks of Jesus as a prophet. A prophet is a man sent from God, and this is what the formerly blind man is now beginning to understand about Jesus. He's not just the man Jesus, but he's also a prophet who has been sent from God. The Pharisees, though, they're unwilling to accept that a genuine miracle has occurred here. So in verse 18 we're told the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight. So they're questioning whether the man was even blind in the first place. They thought, well, this is perhaps some sort of scam going on here, concocted between this man and Jesus. And so what do? They now call in the man's parents for questioning. And they ask the parents, is this your son who you say was blind, born blind? How then does he now see? But their words are implying some doubt about the man's blindness. Who you say was born blind. Well, the man's parents reply by confirming his identity as their son and the fact that he was born blind. Yes, he's our son, he was born blind, but then they say how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. We don't know anything about this. They deny any knowledge of how their son can now see, and instead they say, ask him. He's of age, he will speak for himself. The man is old enough to speak for himself, so just go and ask him. Don't bring us into this. And the reluctance of the man's parents to get involved is explained by John's comment in verse 22. He says his parents said this because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. So the decision of the leaders to put out of the synagogue anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Christ was no idle threat. To be put out of the synagogue was a serious matter. The person put out of the synagogue would in effect be treated as an outcast. They would be rejected by their community and they would have no place to go to worship. Later we see that even some of the authorities themselves who believed in Jesus were afraid to publicly acknowledge him because of this fear. Later on in chapter 12 verse 42, John says, nevertheless many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees they did not confess it, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. So even if some of these high-ranking authorities are afraid of this, what are we to expect of this poor man's parents? How they're going to react? The Pharisees tried to control people by fear and intimidation. And so the blind man's parents are reluctant to say any more than the basic facts. This man is our son. We know he was born blind. Now you ask him yourself if you want to know anything else about him. So the man who's been blind, he's called in again for questioning. And the Pharisees say to him in verse 24, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. And the phrase there, give God the praise, doesn't mean praise God for your healing, but it means tell the truth. Tell us the truth. They're putting the man on oath to tell the truth in the presence of God. And then they presumptuously claim to know that Jesus is a sinner. Tell the truth. We know this man is a sinner. In their eyes, he is a sinner because he has broken the Sabbath. But this man, you have to admire this man. He's more than a match for them. This poor blind beggar. And he's not going to be bullied or intimidated into agreeing with them. He says, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. This man may not know whether Jesus is a sinner, but the one thing, the one undeniable thing that he does know is that he was blind, but now he can see. That this one marvelous thing has happened. Who Jesus is, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know, but this is the one thing I do know and I'm sure of. I was blind, but now I can see. But the Pharisees goad him further by asking, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Again, courageously, this man refuses to be drawn in by them, and he reminds them, I've told you already. How many times do I have to tell you this story, and you would not listen? Why do you want to hear it again? And then, defiantly, he says, do you too want to become his disciples? Well, you can imagine what's going through the minds of the Pharisees when they hear that. They don't like to be spoken in this way, and they respond aggressively, and they resort then to insulting the man. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. So they speak dismissively of Jesus. They hold him in contempt. We know about Moses. We're followers of Moses. We don't even know where this man comes from. You can be one of his disciples if you want to, but we're disciples of Moses. And the blind man is growing in confidence as he expresses his astonishment at the Pharisees' lack of knowledge. Why, this is a marvel. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. The man presents this logical argument which leads to the conclusion that Jesus must be from God. He says, we know God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. That's the logic of this. The fact that this man who was born blind can now see is proof that Jesus is from God, and he acts with God's approval. If Jesus were not from God, then this man would still be blind. But this is very personal. This isn't just about academic knowledge about something. This is the personal effect that this has had upon this man. Well, the Pharisees have heard enough of this, and they're unable to respond to the arguments. So they say to the man, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? When the argument has been lost, the easiest thing to do is to resort to abuse and insult. And they accuse the man of being born in utter sin. Why should such a one as this be lecturing them and telling them what they should be doing? How dare he speak to them like this? And then in a final act designed to humiliate him, the man is cast out. Jesus has been the subject of this conversation going on here between the blind man and the Pharisees. But Jesus has not been present in the story since he instructed the blind man to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. However, somehow or other, Jesus has heard what has happened to the blind man, and how he has been cast out and banished from his own community. This man who had stood up for Jesus when he was questioned by the Pharisees, he had remained true to the one who had healed him, happy to be called a disciple of Jesus. And now, in an act of compassion, Jesus went off to find this blind man. And when he found the man, Jesus asked him, do you believe in the Son of Man? This is the first time this man has seen Jesus. When Jesus put the mud on his eyes and told him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, the man was still blind. And when he returned home able to see, Jesus had already left the scene. This is the first time he's seen Jesus. So for the first time he's seen Jesus, the one who is responsible for his healing. And Jesus asked him if he believed in the Son of Man. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And this was the title that Jesus often used of himself to indicate his identity with mankind. It's a title of the Messiah. In effect, Jesus is asking this man, do you believe in the Messiah? Do you believe in the Christ? And the man replies, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? I may not know who he is, but I want to know who he is. I want to believe in him. He expresses his willingness to believe, although he may not yet know who this Son of Man is. And then comes this wonderful moment of revelation as Jesus says, you have seen him. This man who's been blinded now sees, you have seen him, and it is he who speaks to you. And Jesus identifies himself as this Son of Man, the Son of Man. And the former blind man's response to this revelation is immediate. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. This is the climax to this story, the point to which it has all been leading up. And in this story we can see the progression and the development of this man's faith. Immediately after he had been healed, he referred to Jesus as the man Jesus. Excuse me. He's referred to Jesus as the man Jesus. Later, when asked by the Pharisees what he thought about Jesus, he said, he is a prophet. He was happy for the Pharisees to call him a disciple of Jesus. And later, when questioned further, he said if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So we see how his faith and understanding of Jesus has grown and developed during the story. At the climax here, he confesses his belief in Jesus as the Son of Man. He calls him Lord, and he worships him. Jesus not only healed the man of his physical blindness there, but also brought him spiritual insight into his identity. And the man responded appropriately, showing the characteristics of a true disciple, unlike that lame man who we looked at last week in chapter 5, who did none of that. And the chapter closes with Jesus summarizing his purpose in coming. He says in verse 39, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Jesus claimed to be the light of the world so that those who lacked spiritual sight might gain it, whilst those who thought that they already had the light might become blind. The Pharisees who were hanging around heard Jesus speak these words, and they asked him, are we also blind? They were of those who claimed to have the light. They thought they knew and understood, but in reality, they were the blind ones. They were the spiritually blind. And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now that you say that we see, your guilt remains. The Pharisees claimed to be able to see. They claimed that they knew all of the truth about God. But really, they were blind. And if we claim to be able to see without Jesus, then we remain in a condition of spiritual blindness. It's only by coming to Jesus that we can gain that spiritual sight and we can walk in the light. Jesus is the light of the world, bringing light into our world of darkness. He came to give sight to the spiritually blind, to enable us to walk in his light. And this story of the man who was born blind provides a pattern or a model for us to follow. That we start off in this condition of blindness, spiritual blindness. And it's only through our contact with Jesus that that blindness can be lifted, can be taken away, as that man's blindness was. But we have to come to him, acknowledging him as the Christ, the Son of Man, as he did. And it's in this way then that we receive that spiritual sight and that understanding, and we too can become his disciples. Like the blind man, our understanding of Jesus must progress until we reach that point where we too can say, Lord, I believe. And then, having accepted him as our Lord, we must have the same sort of courage to stand up for Jesus and to remain loyal to him, even in the face of opposition and persecution. So may the story of this man who was born blind give us that encouragement to accept Jesus, to become a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, and then to grow in our understanding of him as we seek to follow him more closely and be his disciples. Thank you.